So today is Thursday, the 7th of September, 2023. We've just come back from our summer break. Well, summer if you're in the northern solstice. Our guest today, special guest today, Jonathan Godfrey, is normally in the southern hemisphere, but today he's in our time zone, at least the UK time zone, because he's attended the R programming sprint that took place at Warwick University just about a week ago. And the main organizer of the sprint, Heather Turner, is also here, which is very nice for us. So the brief introduction to this is that a number of us have known Jonathan Godfrey for a long time, and the R programming sprint allowed a lot of good things to happen. And I'll let Jonathan and Heather tell us about them because I wasn't there. But one of the good things that did happen was that last Sunday I was able to go up to Warwick University and have a long conversation with Jonathan and some conversation with Heather too, which really helped break the ice and make things easier. And this tech hour is, in a sense, a summary and continuation of the conversation that me and Jonathan, and to a certain extent Heather, if she's willing to, had last Sunday. So what I'd like to do now is briefly ask Jonathan to introduce himself and then to talk for a bit about whatever he wants. But I suggest he talks about the importance of community if he's willing to, in the light of the previous programming sprint. So over to you, Jonathan, if you're available.
Sure. I've been a lecturer in statistics. We believe the first blind person to get a position, full-time position as a lecturer in stats. And I've held that role for nigh on 20 years. I, at about that same time, was finishing my PhD. LaTeX was my savior in terms of being able to write mathematical expressions. Of course, I wasn't able to read them, but at least I could write my own equations in a digital form, which ended up in a thesis and various other documents. I continued to use LaTeX through to about 2015. And I don't think I've started a LaTeX document with serious intent since about that time. But of course, because I've moved to R-Markdown, everything I ever learned about making LaTeX documents is still useful knowledge, especially because I'm still writing equations in the same format. The outcome from my Markdown documents, R-Markdown as a particular flavor, is HTML with MathJax rendered equations that my screen reader is doing a pretty good job almost all of the time in handling. I have subsequently been running around casting aspersions on the PDF format, most of which are upheld by other blind users and in the STEM disciplines. I support as many blind people who want to use R as reach out to me. And I think in recent years, the rate at which I am receiving calls for help has declined because the documentation and the R ecosystem has become a much easier thing for blind people to get into and do so on their home ground and not need to reach out to me as much. About 10 years ago, when Heather was the editor of the R Journal, I got an article published in that journal, which had the headline of R is the best, but we can make it better. I had to lament a few things that were happening at the time, and I had to, or felt I was needed to point out why R was so good. I'm actually drafting the sort of sequel, which basically says that the last 10 years have been massive for blind people using R because of so many changes in the ecosystem. And I think the fundamental change that has made the greatest difference is our ability to read documentation, read the work of others, and actually produce our own work along the way. So, it's a sort of a quick history of the last 20 years and my place in it. I don't claim to know everything, but I do try and test whatever I think looks like a good idea. I abandon ship pretty quickly if I think an idea is daft, and I don't mind telling people that that something doesn't work if it has been a resounding failure for me. I like seeing things work well. I really like to see how easy it can be for people to start doing things without me having to be involved. And I think one of my most pleasurable moments at the sprint last week was when several tables away I could hear a couple of people talking about PDF and HTML, and one of them says, and of course people using screen readers are going to be able to work with that HTML. And it took me a while to extract myself from where I was and fight my way over to sort of see if I was needed in that conversation. And I got the sort of, we're all right, thanks, Jonathan. We've got this covered because we know you've been banging away about this topic for the last 10 years. So I took myself back to my laptop and carried on. So, the exposure that the needs of blind people have as users of R, engaging and doing work has certainly increased. Doing work as producers of content, not just the consumers, and generally speaking, that we are much closer to being or having parity than we've ever been before.
So I think that's a good point now. Thank you very much for giving that summary and showing how what's happened in art, particularly through, well, not solely due to your involvement, but if you like, you're the yeast that helped make the bread. So it's very refreshing to see accessibility in action, working, rather than being a technical thing that we're striving for. It's very refreshing to see what's actually happening as a consequence. I wonder, Heather, if you'd be willing to say a little bit, or more if you wish, about the sprint that took place recently. And two things that particularly interest me, and I think other people, would be how many people attended and from where, and where did the funding come from? Would you be willing to answer those questions and whatever else you want to give?
Yes, okay. So we were about 50 people were planned to be there in person. We did lose a few due to some issues beyond our control, such as the issue with the air traffic control that happened in the UK, just as some people were on their way. But yeah, so it was just under 50 people in person and a few more online. A couple of those that weren't able to travel joined the online participants. So it was sort of helpful that we'd at least planned to include some online component. And sort of in terms of the makeup, it was about 10 or 12 members of the R core team. So the core team of developers with responsibility for maintaining the code and documentation that's in the base distribution of R, and then other people from the wider R community, some with experience of contributing externally to the R project, and some quite new, but perhaps had been to some other events that we'd put on to sort of introduce people to how to contribute to the R project, or who had contributed to the R community in other ways. Perhaps contributing an add-on package through CRAN, which is sort of the equivalent of CTAN for the R community. Yeah, so we had quite a mix, and we were also keen to include people that wouldn't normally be included. So we made quite an effort to get people from different parts of the world, not necessarily from academia. You know, so quite a mix of backgrounds, because we were keen to sort of improve the diversity of the contributor community as well as the numbers of contributors. So I think that covers who came. In terms of the funding, there was a large chunk of funding that came through my fellowship. So I have a research software engineering fellowship from the UK, one of the UK research councils, the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. They have funded a number of 5-year research software engineering fellowships over the past 10 years. Sort of, I think I'm in the 4th cohort of about 5 to 10 fellows each time. So you know, there's been quite a group of us to try and develop research software engineering as a profession. And this was an opportunity. So I've been in the R community for quite a long time, and I saw this as an opportunity to get some funding to work on sort of sustainability and diversity issues in the R project. And this sprint was one of the things that I put in my proposal. So I was able to sort of ring fence quite a bit of funding, which mainly went towards people's travel and accommodation to bring all these people together. And then that was sort of topped up with a little bit of funding from my department at Warwick, from the R Foundation, which is sort of the non-profit body that supports the R project, the R Consortium, which is the group of businesses that support the R project, and a little bit of funding from companies that were represented at the sprint, sometimes simply funding the 1 or 2 people that came, but from their company, but sometimes also contributing to the general fund. So a bit of a mix, but I think we were quite happy with sort of what we were able to pull off.
I'd like to invite, if they're willing, I'd like to invite Norman or Kelly to come on next, telling us what, in a sense, why they're here or what they're interested in. Would either of you be willing to do that?
Certainly. In my current role, I have a sort of split responsibility. I have an element of IT support responsibility, and I have a part academic role. So I do some teaching as well as IT manager type things. So I care very much about both aspects of this. And in the teaching I do, I care quite a lot about the notes I give out, and as LaTeX and XML, there's a longer story there. But they, as I think I mentioned when I was introducing myself, they get a very poor score in accessibility terms, and others of my colleagues have found the same thing. They produce notes for undergraduates from LaTeX sources, and they come out and get zeros. And this is very bad. And the question has arisen of what do we do about this? And from a certain amount of background, so this, excuse me, hasn't been my main responsibility at any point, but from a certain amount of digging around, I think we don't really have a terrifically clear story about what to do next. It's clear that LaTeX is going to get better at this in the next few years because there's an ongoing project to do that, to do with adding PDF tags to PDFs. It's not completely clear that's going to really solve the problem in a fundamental sense. It might improve scores, which is not nothing because it stops folk nagging us. But it's not obvious that they will make a big difference to those who are the end users of those PDFs. We've been told PDF dead loss, you want to aim for HTML or even Word documents, because both of these have the important property that they let people manipulate what they see in a way which makes it usable for people like screen readers or people with other impairments who might want to change what they see, who aren't just straightforwardly blind. There are other impairments that exist, and so people might have other things to do to the materials they want, so that HTML and Word, bizarrely, turn out to be good targets for this. We have, I think some in our department have experimented with R-Markdown. It's in the maths department over the road. They are enthusiasts for this, so R-Markdown is a good thing from their point of view because it goes to the right things. We would be starting with a different place. I've experimented with LaTeX ML to go from LaTeX to EPUB, which works rather better than I expected it would, and still seems to have important properties. But it is a bit of an ask in terms of what's required to get that going. So there's a support issue there. So I've written this up in a blog post elsewhere, with a rather indecisive conclusion that we seem to be trying quite hard and not getting and making some progress, but not getting anywhere that we feel terrifically happy with, or that we're convinced that the users that we will presumably have, because we don't have many declared people demanding these accommodations, we have seemed to have got to the place where they are probably better served than they would be, but we're not at all confident that we're in a good place.
I think I'm one of the people that thinks you should abandon all hope that PDF is going to get close to good enough.
Yeah.
I've watched the promises for 20 years, and my life is too short to wait for those promises to come true. I mean, they were saying 15 years ago, we're close, we're a few years away. Well, if I had banked on that promise, I'd be unemployable today.
Yeah. Just parenthetically, there does appear to be a bit of a sprint on within the LaTeX core team right now. It's a 5-year sprint, not much of a sprint, but I think I take your point very forcefully.
I think the message though is that there are solutions and have been HTML solutions from TeX for more than 10 years. And I've been having to create documents that are sent to journals and ultimately are in a PDF form, conference papers and the like. But to make sure that they actually say what I want them to say, I'm parallel processing them into HTML. Now I can do that using a TeX process, not just a Markdown process. So even though I'm starting with Markdown, I can, it goes into a TeX file and then it goes off to a PDF to satisfy the recipient, and an HTML file from that TeX file, so that I know what's happening. That's being done today using practically the same technique I was using 10 years ago, which is TeX for HT is the method I've been using the most.
Right.
Yes, there is LaTeX ML. They are not the only two options. There's Plastech that is extensively used. So there are a number of solutions that are delivering today. I think the problem is that most of the authors who are responsible for the content don't know how to do it. The tools that they use don't give them the option to do it. So it's not in front of them. They just don't know. They see the button up the top that says PDF, so they click it. and there's no button right beside it that says HTML. So of course they don't know and can't find the way easily. But we are making, especially in the last 12 months, we are making massive inroads into getting HTML from TeX source. And we might talk about the R journal later on, but perhaps I think the most convincing argument that is out there today for academics across a multitude of disciplines is what Archive are doing and have done. And they're looking at processing millions of articles into HTML, right? So they've got some seriously big work ahead of them, and they're succeeding. Might not be getting it perfect, but a 90% a 90% HTML file is considerably better than a 2% PDF.
Yes, yeah, I can see that. I if I can jump in there, I think there have been text to HTML converters for more than 10 years. I remember TTH, for example. I've played with TeX for HT. I don't think I played with Plastech, but I've used a couple. And I think my experience with the LaTeX ML was the first that I found, whoa, that works way better than I expected it would. I think they also have a goal of being able to convert all of Archive. I think that's a declared goal.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. And they're working on it.
Yeah.
You know, it's actually happening. It's not it's no longer a talk process. It's
yes.
Process.
I think they have a tool chain.
Yes.
10% of the archive being accessible will be 200,000 documents.
They're past that already.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, I'm going to say how I see the rest of the meeting. We're about halfway through now. I'm going to invite Kelly to speak if she's willing to. And Kelly, you're welcome to come on afterwards if you want to. And Nelson is also welcome to come on. What I'd like to do is, after gathering all our experience, one of the nice themes that I've picked up from an immigrant diaspora community is working together, we can make things better. And I'd like, in the final part, to discuss the R Journal and other matters in the context of building a community. And I think it would be helpful if Jonathan and Heather could talk about the community aspect of the sprint that took place. And this meeting itself is a consequence of that community meeting. So Kelly, would you like to say a few things to the audience and to us? We have thousands of people waiting to watch the videos, you know.
Thanks, Jonathan. Just a slight background in that I'm a biologist for the United States federal government, and I work on mainly marine fish species, and we provide output from computer models that give the documents give information to managers so that they can manage some of the largest fisheries off the US West Coast. And that information leads to hundreds of tables and figures, and these documents need to be accessible to those with disabilities for them to be able to read them, but then also given the federal mandate. And there's a disconnect, I believe, between what's being mandated and what's helpful. And so when we have these documents and the process and the number of hours that goes into them, I'm the lead for our team on this and trying to make sure that all of the documents are accessible. And I've created templates to make it easier for others. But at the end of the day, the information really still isn't that accessible in a PDF. And so I'm trying to find that bridge between what actually is mandated and what works. And I don't think that I'm super successful at the moment. I feel like I'm largely ticking boxes. And so any method that people have that could try to actually make things more helpful and also try to get that information up to the management level, that, you know, no one wants to waste anybody's time, but I don't want to leave people behind at the same time. And so it's a struggle to take somebody like myself that's trained as a biologist and try to, you know what people with disabilities need, and also try to, use scientific principles to get there, because I'm not going to write a Word document from scratch. And so however we can get there and like get the community up to speed and get this information out, because right now I feel like a lot of people are using RStudio and other methods where they can click a button to get the final output, and not knowing the process behind the scenes that goes into that. And when they don't know the process of going from R-Markdown to a TeX to a PDF, it makes it really hard to break apart each of those individual pieces. And so I don't feel that in this instance and for this problem that the larger R community is moving forward at the speed that we need them to. And so if we can get the information out to others, like Jonathan, you were talking about your protocol as far as how you go from an R-Markdown to a TeX to a HTML. And if we could make that more mainstream for others, say using inside RStudio, or if we had GitHub Actions that could create that, and the action was a reproducible action that allows other people to use it, I think that the more people without the disabilities that can rely on PDFs understand the process of going to an HTML, then I think we would get a lot further faster. Thanks. Jonathan, you're muted.
Thank you very much for noticing that, Kelly. Carla, are you interested in talking? If so, just open your microphone and off you go. And I should say that Nelson is having problems with his computer, which means that he can't speak to us. So let's try and put things together. I think one of the things that's really important to realize is that many people writing documents are highly trained, intelligent people, highly skilled people, but their skill may not be mathematics or computer science and may not be LaTeX. And there's no reason to demand that people become experts in LaTeX in order that they use LaTeX. And similarly for RStudio. And the next thing is that the R community is functioning as a community in a way that I find very pleasant. And Heather telling us about the sprint gives an example of that. And Jonathan later, I think, will tell us some of the things that happened at the meeting. So the R journal is going from PDF to PDF and HTML. And that, I think, is a project that will have an impact in all sorts of ways. It's a project I'm willing to support, even though I'm not a statistician, I'm not a reader of the R journal, but because where the R journal goes, other people can follow. And working to help the R journal achieve accessibility will, for example, allow other people to have a clearer idea of what accessibility needs, because the R Journal has a first-rate expert in accessibility. He's with us here, it's Jonathan Godfrey. So if we, so to speak, mimic what has been done in the R Journal in terms of achieving accessibility, then it should work for other people, and certainly better than us sighted people imagining what it is like to be blind, which is at present the best strategy I have, because I don't regularly meet people who are blind except in this context. So that's part of what I'm seeing here. And we've spoken about the Archive Accessibility Initiative, and we haven't spoken about HTML from LaTeX source for our documentation, but I'll say something about that there, which is that in Python, Python documentation was originally written in LaTeX, and a modified version of LaTeX to HTML was used to produce the web pages. And at some point, it became clear that that was no longer functioning well enough. And they created a custom markup language called restructured text, which has similarities with R-Markdown, if you like. And from that, they generated HTML on the one side and LaTeX that can be turned into PDF on the other side, which is the direction that the R Journal is going towards. And the R community has also produced something called Quarto, which is more like the Python approach with the restructured text. So there's a lot of prior art in this area that people who are experts in statistics and R are not likely necessarily to be experts in Python, whereas there's people like me that don't know much about statistics but love learning about what computers can do. So we need to have a lot of connections and interactions and contacts, and in a certain sense we need a sort of forum or marketplace for ideas. Something that struck me very, very strongly when I went to Athens was the historic agora, which stands for both square, meeting place, and market. So the historical market in ancient Athens was also the place at which the democratic assemblies took place. So we want some sort of meeting place for people concerned with accessibility. And because this is the Tech Hour, we're particularly interested in accessible documents, but another side of it is accessible software. So what I suggest now is that I ask Jonathan Godfrey to talk again, and he might want to talk about his ideas for a browser-based REPL. I think that might fit in quite well because it will sort of enlarge the scope of what we have to think about in a useful way.
Sure. Just a little run through of the help files in R. When you build a package, you have to go through the process of doing documentation, and while the file might end in .rd, the structure of what you put in that plain text is actually all TeX. It's got the backslashes everywhere in sight, and it's got curly braces everywhere in sight, and in the end, it's processed in two ways. So when you build your package, there's a manual, a PDF manual that gets stuck on the official repository site. That is quite clearly a tech-driven process. But at the same time, for that text file that is laden with tech-like structures is as a Windows user, and Mac I believe as well, is converted into HTML pages, and it's been done for a very long time now. A Linux user is seeing the same help information but it doesn't have all the HTML tagging that makes it that would make it a pleasure to read. It becomes much more plain text. So people have been making these sort of solutions and some workarounds for in certain places for some time. And I think just reminding people about why that matters is actually important. I believe that that by going and putting myself out there, by going to use our conferences and making sure that I got in the faces of a few people, not always leading to a successful outcome. I mean, I did invite RStudio a considerable number of times to invest in accessibility, and it's failed miserably. But I have had so many other successes because people know who I am. I'm not just a name on the end of an email. So I think it's important to have presented the issues, conference papers, presented the issues in terms of in discussion, and being available to answer questions as well. And I say being available to answer questions because at the sprint last week, I was rather surprised when someone turned around after helping me for a day and a half work out a problem or two for blind users. That individual then asked me to give him feedback on something he was proposing. And it was looking at a new interface, a much cut back interface for R. And there's several projects that are all doing similar things, none of which are yet coming to full fruition. But the solution that was on the table had all of the back end talking from the browser back to R, and none of the front end part of the browser HTML page that I was going to find as appealing as could be possible. And because I knew I was coming to the sprint and wanted to be able to say to people, look, in an ideal world, we would have an interface that looks like this, if only you can help me fill in the gaps. So I, on GitHub, have a front end with no back end at all, right? It's a hollow shell of this is what it would look like to the user with no functionality. So I'm hoping that by merging some of these projects and feeding off each other and learning what we need and why, we will end up with a much easier browser-based interface for R sometime, and it could be in the very near future if everyone continues with their current level of enthusiasm. During the sprint, the two things that I was able to work on, and only possible because of the assistance of others, and in one case, because that person had tried a parallel project that had nothing to do with accessibility, but he had the functionality that we needed, and so pretty soon I will be rolling out the next version of the package that is going to give us a means of saving the entire work session in a single text file. And this is something that we haven't been able to do before, because in an R session, as your output scrolls off the top of the screen, it's sort of gone. And while it might be a really good idea to use script files or R-Markdown, those aren't the first steps. You don't start using R at the point of using R-Markdown. You start by interacting with the console and doing something even as boring as 1 + 1. And if you don't know how to work R with your screen reader in an optimal fashion, you can soon find yourself frustrated. And I think, so being able to actually just save the entire session from today or even just the output from the last command that may have scrolled off the screen. This is made possible because we had the right people sitting down having a conversation and expressing what it was they needed, and what they had on the table to offer as a partial solution. So last Friday morning, four of us in the end sat down, and in an hour and a quarter, we did 1 hour of talking and 15 minutes of bashing out code. Each of us doing a little bit, and the collective of that effort, and me doing an hour or two afterwards, has led to a viable proposition that I'm ready to test with other blind users. So I think community matters, right? This R sprint was the first of its kind, but you've got a bunch of people coming together willing to put their knowledge to good use and be communicating with each other. I think that's only possible if you've got a community that already has a cooperative feel to it already. You can't make people cooperate by saying, hey, let's cooperate. You know, it doesn't quite work like that. So people have to come along with a bit more willingness. And I believe that through the interactions I've had in the R community over especially the last 10 years, I've been able to ask little things of very important people, and have some really profound impact by ultimately asking something small of someone who's in a very influential position. So I think community matters. I think the communities that are working best have ways of sharing knowledge, of empowering other people within their communities, and in that way growing the community. An obvious thing that we need to do in some communities, in STEM especially, is to take a serious look at our diversity and inclusion, and various communities need to actually have a look at themselves and go, do we invite participation from minority groups or underrepresented sections of society? And if we don't, why not? It's a pretty brave call for the Pale Male Stale Brigade to actually say we need to change. So I'll put that out there. I'm happy to take comments and questions, Jonathan. So.
Well, Jonathan's put his cards on the table. Thank you.
I don't know any other way.
Yeah, there was something that struck me in a different setting, which was meet regularly, harmoniously in large numbers. And large might be 50, it might be 100, it might be 5. 5 might be a large number if you're in a department, but to meet regularly and harmoniously. I think open source at its best is empowering. I think that open source is at its worst is no better than closed source. And the freedom of spirit and cooperation that Jonathan Godfrey was talking about, Nelson Mandela put it quite well, which is if two people are working together for a common purpose, then they forget their enmities, their hostilities to each other. If we're working together to a shared purpose, then that is one way to overcome hostility between us. And accessibility is a shared purpose that is very wide-reaching, and all of us have some sort of disability at some time, even if it's simply I broke my leg, or I have toothache, or I need to wear spectacles, or it might be more serious, or somebody I know has a disability. But the failure to the closed doors that disabled people have faced represents a social loss that impoverishes us all. And so coming together on the ground of disability is well worth doing. I'm personally interested, because I'm a tech user, in making the R journal good, because it's already working in that direction. And we need these examples of success, of this is how it works. There are many discoveries where the important thing is simply, there's only one big secret, which is that it can be done. Once you know it can be done, it sort of becomes easy or less difficult. And the development of community spirit is something that I'd like to see more of. I'll stop at that point. And Norman's got his hand up. You're on, Norman.
In a slight spirit of contradiction, I'll say that while I agree with what you're saying, I think that quite a lot of people who are taking an interest in accessibility are doing so because that's the rule, that there is a requirement that things be accessible. And when Kelly mentioned how motivations there, one of the things you mentioned in passing was that there was a regulatory requirement that things be accessible. And that, I think, has two consequences. First, that some people, it's an element of motivation. I mean, some people will be interested in accessibility for that reason only. And it's not the worst motivation. It's good that motivation exists. I think the other aspect of that, the other half of that, is the part of that motivation is one that is satisfied by tick boxes. And I think those are two bits of context that have to be sort of woven in to a full response to how does one approach the problem, because there's quite a good accessibility mailing list that's run by JISC in the UK, which covers this sort of stuff. It's not actually terribly useful because it doesn't say much about maths, but the title of it is just accessibility regulations. So up there in the title of the group is the regulatory imperative. So without disagreeing with the motivations and aspirations, Jonathan, I think that it would be careless to forget that the secondary and possibly base motivation that many folk will have coming into this.
Perhaps I can add a bit there. I think accessibility can also present an opportunity. So that's one thing that has got me involved in accessibility, because the sort of existing established contributors haven't necessarily thought about it too much. So it's an opportunity for new people to come in and to say, well, I've got some ideas, and these are tasks that new people can do because nobody's doing them yet. So in the context of the R journal, there's sort of been a couple of ways that that's happened. Sort of the sort of initial phase was creating a new template for new articles to sort of publish articles as HTML instead of the old PDF style, using the old sort of tech workflow. And a lot of that work was done by funding PhD students as to do side projects that were sort of supervised by one of the editors of the R journal. And the work that I've been involved in more recently has then taken that a step further to start converting legacy articles. And a large component of that work has been done through Google Summer of Code. So this is, sort of, new contributors to the community, and paid opportunities, which is nice. And again, with the sprint last week, the accessibility projects that Jonathan suggested was something that we could bring to the table. That they weren't coming top down from the core developers, so it felt like a bit more of a two-way process between the established people and those that were interested in getting more involved in contribution and opening this dialogue with the wider community.
Thank you very much, Heather and Norman. I'd like to say a bit about the regulatory thing. I'd forgotten about it, quite honestly, because it no longer impacts my life. My life is extremely unregulated. But I was in the Open University, and the regulatory aspects of it were, but still are, I expect, very important. The regulations are actually quite important because they embody a social value, which is that disabled people have rights to reasonable adjustments being made for them. And if you're given a right, but no means of enforcing it, then you're not being given the right. Magna Carta is a legally enforceable document. The US Constitution is a legally enforceable document. And the disability legislation is legally enforceable. And so in the context of the universities, what is social policy? Social policy is that you're not thrown on the scrap heap because you have a disability. That's social policy. And as a result of social policy, there are laws and regulatory requirements, just as equal pay is a social policy and therefore a regulation and legally enforceable. So they're not that different to each other. The enthusiasm for various causes, of course, social policy to be made. There's no sort of, well, let's not get into the rights of people and that sort of stuff. So there's a mixture of stuff. And I admit that I hadn't thought of regulation when I was talking about what I was saying. And regulation is quite helpful for encouraging people to do the right thing. I wouldn't like speed limits to depend just on the goodwill of the motorists. And as a non-drinker, I'm quite pleased that people who have an accident in a car can be breathalyzed to see if they've drunk too much. Whereas there was a time when social policy was such that breathalyzing wasn't approved of, just as there was a time when cigarette smoking was considered to be a mild irritant at worst. So we've moved forward quite a bit since then. I'll stop now because I've said too much.
I think that I don't at all in any way disagree with you. That there's a very important social obligation here, but I think it's probably useful to when thinking of what to do next, to recognise and build in to any plans that some of the folk involved are doing it not primarily, perhaps secondarily, but not primarily because they think it's the right thing to do, but because they have to. And that means that they will come to the question of what do I do here, with a focus on with as little effort as possible, and so bearing in mind that things that a righteous goal is a good goal, but it's not something that will sell it to someone who really has no time and has an obligation to tick a box. And so something which is it makes it possible for someone to do what they need to do in the best way for the minimal cost is a useful way of dealing with that ugly imperative.
I think
so Kelly's got her hand up, so we'll put Kelly on next, if that's all right, Kelly.
Yeah, I think that people that are willing to put themselves out there, like Jonathan, as you've done in answering questions, because the disconnect for me is I don't want to be that person that just ticks a box. I want what I produce to actually be helpful. And so, but like the government regulations aren't necessarily descriptive enough to actually be helpful. And so I think by being able to reach out to people that need the result has been the most helpful to me. And Jonathan has been one of those where, you know, the emails that I've sent, hey, should I do it this way or this way? Because what actually matters is, I think, the best. But the biggest thing for me, I think that's disheartening, is the comment that Jonathan made earlier that PDF just isn't going to get there. And so that's not being advertised to me on the daily. And, you know, we need PDFs. We have to have PDFs. We have to have PDFs. And so, like, what is the best alternative? And with HTML and Word being options, I guess I'd just like to know, so obviously the R world, the R journal is going towards HTML, and I have other colleagues that are going towards Microsoft Word. We can produce both from R-Markdown, but like which avenue is more helpful to those who actually need the end product?
I think
I'm going to come in at this point to say one thing, which is that the tech hour is 6:30 to 7:30, and people can stay on later if they want to. So if anybody wants to go now, they can go without being rude, and then we can continue as long as we like. I'm willing to stay another hour if there are people still talking. So we can continue the discussion as long as we want, but those that want to go can leave. So I'm mute myself.
It's Jonathan speaking. To address Kelly's question, Word or HTML, I think the reason why people have liked PDF over the years is that it creates this illusion that that it doesn't get tampered with by the reader. And if that's part of the reason for using PDF, that it is what you want your readership to be seeing without breaking or being manipulated, then PDF and HTML are the two options. It's very easy to accidentally edit a Word file while you're reading it. It doesn't take much to do something silly. So, you know, the version of record, if you like, must be this sort of hard to alter document, and that could be PDF, it could be HTML, but I doubt that it will ever be Word. You know, the version of record. But Word files aren't always the nicest, but can be, you know, quite easy for many people to digest. But screen readers, while they might do a good job of handling Microsoft tools, you know, the number one thing that is ensured in the development and maintenance of screen reader software is the ability of people to browse on the web. You know, because that's how we do our business. That's how we read the newspaper. That's how we get on with life a lot more now than we did 25 years ago. But you know, there's very little difference between Word and HTML in a consumption sense. If you can guarantee that the person you want to read the document has Microsoft Word and has a decently recent version of it and has all the tools that are required to consume the content that you are putting into that document that you're reading, And I doubt that you can uniformly say that that's true for Microsoft Word. You know, open a current document in a version of Word that's 4 years old and see how much you break. So, you know, I think in terms of forwards compatibility and all those reasons for not wasting effort, that HTML is a better answer. It just makes more sense to me.
I think what's right and wrong, and I don't like those words, or I use them rarely, let's say, depends a lot on context and who I am and what the context is. If there is somebody in front of me that has a disability, then I have a responsibility. This happened to me when I was traveling to visit Jonathan on Sunday. There was somebody that came onto the train. They walked up a ramp to get into the carriage, and I sort of got up to make a seat for them and started a conversation. And it turned out the person had had a spine operation and couldn't sit down comfortably and so forth. And I did what I could, which was a certain amount, to help them. So if you're teaching and you have students with disabilities, then you have particular responsibilities there. If you are a disabled person, blind person, and you want to work as a legal secretary and the profession requires you to know Word, then you want Word to be accessible. Even though Word might be, so to speak, inferior in a number of ways. So the immediate responsibility each of us has depends on exactly where we are and what our surroundings are. And having frog and mouse battles about big ideas is sometimes important and sometimes not. The situation with Word, I think, is not with PDF, is I think a little bit delicate in that there are documents that are not highly structured that are traditionally produced in PDF. And if the PDF were accessible, then I expect that the documents then become accessible. But that clearly won't work for the highly structured documents, and the highly structured, complicated documents, I suspect, have to be written with a view to accessibility in order to be accessible. I'll stop at that point, although I might have more to say later. I apologise if I present my opinions as truths. They're just my opinions.
Don't worry, don't worry.
I try and state them as clearly as possible in the hope that the clear statement will make any holes in them more obvious.
If there's a gap, I'll inject my other concern here, which I touched on when I was introducing myself earlier, which is that I think in the last couple of years, I've had, as far as I can tell, no blind students in my class. So, I mean, because I look at them, I can see. But the accessibility is still important because there are all sort of other impairments, and I in a way I worry that it's very straightforward to talk about blindness because we all understand it. It's in a sense fairly obvious, it's intelligible, and you know the solution, finding something that works with a screen reader, is very presents itself obviously. But I think it's probably quite important that we bear in mind the rather amorphous set of other impairments, which might be just other visual impairments or neurodiversity type impairments, which have some bearing on this. And I think there's a less well organized set of answers to what should be done in that case. So I mean, and I don't have any suggestions here, nor any very specific worries, but without dismissing the idea that there's a terribly important thing to be done here, making things screen reader friendly, it's probably quite important that we don't forget there are other things we should possibly be worrying about, which people are less well organised about pointing out.
But I think while my expertise lies in blindness, not in even low vision, if you give someone a PDF, it's very difficult for them to manipulate that for something even as simple as having a dark mode, right? For anyone who's got sensitivities that are best addressed with a dark mode. Well, you don't get that opportunity in a PDF. Whereas in HTML, you don't need to know what software the people reading your document are going to have to work with or are already working with. You don't need to know. You need to know when whatever tools they are using and what you offer them don't work. And so I think rather than people looking for the affirmation that someone's going to come forward and say, you know, thank you very much for doing this, it made it accessible for me. I think it's I didn't get people coming forward and complaining that it was inaccessible.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, you know, we have increasing numbers of neurodiverse students at my university coming through because we are delivering things in a manner that is easier for them to work with. Like, I'm not going to say it's perfect because I actually don't know how to make it better than what we're doing. So I'm not going to assume it's perfect. But HTML gives people choices in a way that PDF doesn't, in a way that if you were delivering it as a Word document, they have to work to get the document to be switching colors and stuff. There's an effort required. But HTML is opened in a browser, and those same people are surfing the web, you know, probably as often as we are. So they've got the tools and the solutions that they need as individuals. We just need to provide an object that has got some universal design thinking built in to make it flexible. So, you know, I'm you know, some of the issues that Heather and I have been discussing about the legacy conversion documents. You know, I can see where my screen reader is failing to leave me understanding what's going on. Seldom is something that I'm suggesting that is good for a screen reader user in conflict with anyone else, if it's HTML.
Yep. I see Kelly's a hand up. I'll be very brief and say that yes, I'm hearing you loud and clear that PDF is a dead loss, and I will. I mean that reassures me on the impression I already have, and that's something I will pass on to my colleagues, and also the fact that you're saying that HTML is basically going to be basically all right. Folk can sort of sort themselves out from that point on. It's a very reassuring thing to hear.
It's very easy to go from 0 to 90%.
Yeah.
Right. And then worry about the other 10 when someone comes along and says what they need. But that's going to remove 90% of the workload on the support systems we are currently using. And I venture to suggest that if people making content were the ones who had to sit around, had to turn around and read all that content to the blind person in their class, you know, they'd be pretty keen to make sure that they didn't have to spend 3 or 4 hours a week reading their work out loud or recording it. And that's what we used to have to do. So we are not doing anywhere near as much recording of material as was done when I was an undergraduate 30 odd years ago. Yes,
I remember doing that.
Well, Kelly's next after Jonathan.
Yeah, so I think it's the investment in saving time and effort down the track as well that needs to be thought of. Just one more point on Norman's regulation things. Regulations are not the friend of disabled people, really. We don't get to exercise our rights through regulations because it's so hard to turn around and have a conversation. If I walk into a lecturer's office and say, you have to give me this because the law says so. It's not a very good conversation starter. We cannot afford to go for the litigation type approach, because in the meantime we could have finished an undergraduate degree at a different university.
Sure.
And voting with your feet, or knowing where the universities are that best support people, and communicating within our own blindness communities, makes a huge difference. And people are doing it.
Kelly.
Yeah, I have a really low level question, and it relates back to R. And how do you make it where you can easily go from making a table that outputs to HTML versus LaTeX without having to manually change something in your RMD file? Because for like a cable, you have to declare what your output is. So do you just make an argument in your YAML header that says, like what you're outputting to, or do you not use cable extra that requires you to declare what your output format is?
You can switch it on the basis of what is the actual output format you are making right now. So you can do an if command. If I'm making, if my output format is this, do blah. If it's that, do the other. So you can hardwire making the TeX version if that's where it's heading, or hardwire the HTML version if that's where it's heading.
It seems like R-Markdown used to be smarter. And I don't know if that was because it was using not using an external package, like when you were creating tables, and then just this added layer of cable is making things where you have to do that. But I thought before that, like when you made tables, it looked to see what you were rendering towards. And if it was an HTML, it would structure them for HTML. And if your output was a PDF, it would put them in LaTeX. And is there just like this disconnect with R-Markdown and cable that needs to be fixed? Or am I like not remembering it right?
I wouldn't suspect there's a disconnect between R-Markdown and cable, because the package owners are pretty chummy for those two packages, and the same person in charge of cable is heavily involved in the R-Markdown package. It's because it's in Knitr. So that might not be the problem. You certainly have problems when people go and use the more elaborate table creation packages, which have their inherent bias towards a particular style of output. So the more flash you get, the harder it is to be true to both output formats.
I'm going to say something that comes back from my experience actually at Cambridge University Press, when we were when the University Press was converting books to XML, which is, my understanding is that there are basically two different table models. There's the LaTeX or TeX table model and the HTML table model. And whilst they have an intersection, there's also a lot of features that belong to the one side rather than the other. And that is a fundamental cause of the problems, I think, that Jonathan was talking about when we were talking about elaborate tables. For printed documents, I suspect that TeX has got the best table model. For interactive documents, and I would say that a document being read by a screen reader is an interactive document. What is important is having a good model for the data and some means of navigating that data. And most of the time, a table will do it, if you know what I mean. A sort of off-the-shelf standard table will do it. But if you've got complicated data to present, then I think to do it justice, you need to have some element of navigation that's specific to the features of the data. And I don't know that any of the tools provide that. But when people try to do that in PDF and succeed, they're unlikely to succeed when HTML is generated.
I think the merging of cells across columns, so building the length of the cell across the page, that works better than any building in a vertical, merging in a vertical direction. But there is no difference for a flat table with n rows and p columns as long as there are n times p cells. Right? Yeah. The outcome is equivalent in both. The issues start when we start doing multiple layering of headings and merging cells as a consequence. And sometimes it's not always necessary.
+1, I agree. Kelly, do you feel happy with that?
Yeah, I'd like to get rid of the ability to merge cells in anything, to be honest.
You're not going to get any arguments from me.
I'm going to toss in something, which is that in the beginning days, the C language was extremely permissive and allowed you to do things such as shoot yourself in the foot. And a program called lint was developed, which was a bit like the lint filter in your tumble dryer, if you have one, that sort of picked up all the bits of fluff and so forth. And so a linter is something that finds things in your code that are a bit iffy. And in some sense, accessibility linters would be quite useful. Read a document and say, oh, look, there are these things in your document. Are you really sure that you want to be doing this? And a linter for tables could be quite a useful nudge for improving quality and helping educate users as to what's good practice and what's not good practice. Norman, you're on next.
And from in terms of implementing that, LaTeX ML, which is, as I say, of the various variants, the one that I've spent most time with recently, has an intermediate XML form, which is sort of a parse tree of the document, from which the HTML is generated, and that's the sort of place where that sort of linter could happen. In case it's not obvious, I've been really, more impressed than I thought I ever would be by the LaTeX ML's performance.
Kelly.
Sorry to be like super pessimistic here, but I feel like those people that would use the linter are already care. And it's the people that don't care and that aren't up to date on the issues that wouldn't install the linter to like begin with. And those are the ones that need to be brought on board. And so the linter is only helpful if someone's going to use it, but how do you get somebody to stop using the merged cells when they just like want to go down their merry way? Like I have people that won't even use linters because for like line length on something, they don't like seeing all of the blue stuff screaming at them saying that their code is not formatted right, and so they just don't use the linter.
Then they don't need their work put on the internet, and they don't need to no, I'll stop there.
Yeah.
The retirement is nice.
That's where I say, like, it's not fair to have this ability to make these really intricate tables that as every single layer, it becomes more and more or less and less accessible. And so if we stopped getting rid of creating like all of these super fancy options and put more work into just building up the base options, I feel like we would get further faster rather than having a huge like bridge that needs to be built between those that make really fancy stuff that's only accessible to some versus those that are trying to move everything along at the same speed.
I'm very much in favor of having a core collection of documents and templates or tool chains for producing these documents that work well for accessibility, and sort of any sort of health a lot of health documents should be of that nature. That what's important is that they read easily and straightforwardly for as many people as possible. The documents that are widely translated into other languages should also be available in accessible formats, and the way to achieve that is through simplicity. When the subject is complicated, we're in the situation of the Nobel laureate who was asked to explain his work in 5 minutes to a reporter. And he said, if I could explain it in 5 minutes, it wouldn't get the Nobel Prize. Most people's work is not like that and does not need extensive, complicated formatting.
Rutherford would disagree with that point of view.
What?
Rutherford would disagree with that point of view.
Oh, I've never met Rutherford.
Well, he's dead now, but he claimed, using a rather old-fashioned way of putting it, that if you can't explain your work to the average barmaid, you don't understand it yourself. Was how he put it.
Okay.
I want to point out that said individual was born in New Zealand. It's a very good attitude.
Yes, yeah.
He was in New Zealand, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah. But Heather, do you want to? You're smiling at us.
I'm just enjoying the conversation. I think you're right that keeping it simple is always a good idea, and and making sure that it doing something simple well is always a good plan, I think.
Had a fascinating discussion today at lunchtime with a couple of Warwick people whose job it is to make web content and teaching materials more readily available and readable. And of course, they've got the same problems. They never see a blind student, etc., etc. But we talked about setting things up so that it's hard for people to do the wrong thing and very easy for them to do the right thing. Now, I think that TeX has got this wrong at the moment because it's too easy to make PDF and too hard to make HTML, right? Whereas R-Markdown, it's very easy to make HTML, and you can go and make a coffee sometimes in the time it takes for the PDF to be built. So people are automatically encouraged for that instant gratification to work in HTML because they want their instant results, and that is modifying behavior by stealth. There's nothing out there that says you will work in, but more and more people are moving to work in R-Markdown and HTML because it's so easy for them to do so in RStudio.
Norman,
that's interesting because at an early part of this conversation, I was looking at the Overleaf website, and for those of you who don't know, Overleaf is a web-based LaTeX writing environment. And I, on the Overleaf website, which is very good and increasingly popular, there's some folk who have given up having a local install of LaTeX on their machine because they just use Overleaf for everything. And I searched for HTML on the Overleaf website, and the only things I found were things about using Markdown inside your LaTeX documents. Which is sort of, okay, I can see how that's come about, but I would have guessed that I wouldn't have been terribly surprised to discover that the Overleaf folk had put LaTeX ML on the, maybe had made that an alternative output format for LaTeX documents. But if one were looking for interesting places to apply pressure, then that's the sort of place that might have big results. Because if folk can go to Overleaf and go, oh, I can put HTML, oh, that's good, I take a box and do the right thing, and it's easy, then that would be a really powerful place to apply pressure.
Well, I'm going
to come in on that, which is that Overleaf have got a real interest. It would be to their advantage to have a button that will process your LaTeX document into HTML using precisely the process used on the archive.
But they could do that, yeah.
Yeah. And it's not that the process is precisely specified, but that it's being used by the archive.
Yeah.
And so that they can preview what their HTML will look like when it's published at the archive.
That would be hugely attractive for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So the archive process still has to get to the point where submitting authors are actually actively reviewing their HTML versions as well as the PDF. So there's still work to do in that space. I think looking at the, having worked with the R-Journal template today, the fact that yes, it's making the HTML that I want to read, and it's also making the PDF on the side as well. There are tool chains that work. So having these examples, so rather than just writing on the GitHub a page for Overleaf to say I want my HTML, please, like I can get with Archive, like I can get with the R-Journal. So having some of these really useful examples actually matters. People don't want to invest, most people don't want to invest big corporate money into things that they don't know have a solution. So showing them the solution exists is important.
I'm going to have to head off, I'm afraid. So thank you very much. I will get on with your rest of your conversation, and thank you for the conversation, and I will join you again soon, I'm sure.
Lovely.
Thank you very much,
Bye-bye.
Norman. Very much appreciated. Well, I think one way to continue this is to have another meeting in a month or two. But in the meantime, make some progress on a few things. I think me and Heather will be doing something with the R-Journal. I'll be making my own contribution to that project. I hope there could be other ways forward. I did specifically send an invitation to the LaTeX 3 project, saying that this is an opportunity to talk with Jonathan about the archive accessibility project. And as you can see, nobody's come and nobody's replied. I think that there's a bit of a gulf here.
But there might be today. This is the thing. I think there might be today. But when they start to see that the tide is turning, because Archive is doing it with a large volume of articles, most publishers that are receiving, your big publishers, your Elsevier's, your Taylor and Francis, and your Wiley, they're all receiving LaTeX documents, and they're all pumping out HTML. So, if you're not doing it, at some point, if you are not generating HTML, your business model is going to be in the left behind side of things. So, I am really encouraged by how much HTML readable content I am able to digest today. I don't have to do what I did 10 or 15 years ago, which was scout around looking for something to read that I could read. I now have to go, which of all of these documents that I can read do I have the time to engage with? So documents are now fighting for my attention. And, I think that's cool.
I think Jonathan's right there. I think my concern is that at some point, if authors, academic authors, or the authors of STEM articles don't switch from LaTeX, then what will happen will become LaTeX will become a highly organized, highly regulated system that goes into journals, and we will authors will lose the ability to, so to speak, control their outputs. I'm worried that if authors don't move, if the LaTeX team don't move, and if authors don't move, then there are valuable things in the tech community and in tech past practice that will go. So that's the sort of concern I have. I think from Jonathan's point of view, it is to his benefit, and all for it. But I'm really worried that authors will find themselves having no choice but to use LaTeX, and then the conversion to HTML is under the control of either the archive or publishers. Whereas the thing about LaTeX, at least in the early days, was the authors had a measure of control and open source, sort of, I can make it do what I want. So I think we want a tool chain that authors can adapt in the same way that LaTeX was the tool chain that authors could adapt. That's probably a topic for another meeting, and probably not this year. I'm going to express my appreciation to everybody for coming along, and I'm really heartened by everything that's happened. A big thanks to Jonathan for coming along and sharing a time zone with us, and a big thanks to Heather for making that possible. More power to you. So that's my goodbyes and thank yous.